Welcome. I'm Erik Fleming, host of A Moment with Erik Fleming, the podcast of our time. I want to personally thank you for listening to the podcast. If you like what you're hearing, then I need you to do a few things. First, I need subscribers. I'm on Patreon at patreon.com/A Moment with Erik Fleming. Your subscription allows an independent podcaster like me the freedom to speak truth to power and to expand and improve the show. Second, leave a 5-star review for the podcast on the streaming service you listen to it. That will help the podcast tremendously. Third, go to the website, momenterik.com. There you can subscribe to the podcast, leave reviews and comments, listen to past episodes, and even learn a little bit about your host. Lastly, don't keep this a secret like it's your own personal guilty pleasure. Tell someone else about the podcast. Encourage others to listen to the podcast and share the podcast on your social media platforms because it is time to make this moment a movement. Thanks in advance for supporting the podcast of our time. I hope you enjoyed this episode as well.
The following program is hosted by the NVG Podcast Network.
Hello, and welcome to another Moment with Erik Fleming. I am your host, Erik Fleming. So today I have 3 guests, 3 young ladies who've come on. One is Crystal FitzSimons. She is the president of the Food Research and Action Center, better known as FRAC. So we're going to be talking about hunger in America with her. Pauline Steinhorn, who has written this incredible book called Dreaming of the River, which talks about a mother and a daughter who escaped the Holocaust. And then I'm going to have this sister on named Dehjah Vaughn. Dehjah is pursuing her PhD in political science. She's an educator and she's a podcaster. She's a creative in the Atlanta area and probably one of the most dynamic personalities that you haven't met yet, but you will today. So I was really glad to get them on. So a little bit of housekeeping. Last week we had reported, we had what I call our Dewey defeats Truman moment. When we did the podcast and Grace did the news summary, we were under the impression that Karen Bass was going to be running against Spencer Pratt. That's not the case. As the votes kept coming in, a member of the city council, Dehjah Vaughn, pulled ahead of Mr. Pratt. And when it was all said and done, I think she beat him by like 23,000 votes. So the runoff will be between Mayor Karen Bass and City Council member Dehjah Vaughn in November, which was really what people expected, but Spencer Pratt ran a better race than a lot of people thought he would, considering who he is and what he was saying. But the reality kicked in Los Angeles, and once all the votes were counted, it's the 2 Democrats that'll be running against each other because they had that jungle primary in California where it's possible that 2 people from the same party runs. New Orleans and Louisiana is like that as well. Well, at least they were. I don't know if they've changed or not, but I remember when I was real active in politics, they had jungle primaries there too. So that race will be very interesting because that'll be the progressives, because they're kind of touting Rahman as a Mamdani-like candidate and Karen Bass as the establishment candidate. So we'll see how that works out. But it's going to be 2 women of color, so it's going to be a woman of color that's going to be mayor of Los Angeles, whether it's Mayor Bass again or Councilmember Rahman. So I wanted to get that on the record. And I also want to make my appeal to folks to go to momenteric.com, do what you can to support the podcast. We're going to be making some changes, and it's early enough to know that the changes are going to happen. It's too early to be specific about how the changes are going to work because still trying to maneuver some things, but life happens. Usually when people say that, that's a negative connotation, but sometimes it's a positive. So life has happened, and we're going to be making some adjustments with the podcast going forward, exploring some ideas and, just trying to see how it's going to work. But for now, we're going to be the same. We're quickly approaching season 14. So, a lot of those changes will kick in right around then. So I just thank y'all for listening. I thank y'all for the support. But if you feel so inclined to either subscribe or just give a one-time donation, please go to momenteric.com and do that. One of the things that's not going to change, at least in the foreseeable future, is Grace G giving the news summary. So let's go ahead and start this program. And as always, we kick it off with a moment of news with Grace G.
Thanks, Erik. 19-year-old Carmelo Anthony was sentenced to 35 years in prison after an all-white Texas jury found him guilty of murder for the fatal stabbing of Austin Metcalf during a 2025 high school track meet. The U.S. Congress passed a bill providing $70 billion in additional immigration enforcement funding for the Department of Homeland Security. Federal prosecutors have reached a plea deal with Vance Belter, the man accused of the politically motivated assassination of Minnesota State Representative Melissa Hortman and her husband. President Trump issued a full pardon to former U.S. Representative Stephen Breyer, who was convicted of insider trading in 2023. Two African Americans, Nevada Attorney General Aaron Ford and South Carolina State Representative Dr. Jermaine Johnson, won their respective Democratic gubernatorial nominations. Graham Plattner won Maine's U.S. Senate Democratic primary by a wide margin, despite recent controversies about his past personal behavior. In South Carolina's Republican gubernatorial primary, U.S. Representative Nancy Mace failed to reach the runoff election after facing opposition from President Trump. The Florida Supreme Court has allowed a Republican-drawn congressional map designed to flip up to 4 Democratic seats to remain in place for the upcoming midterm elections. A federal judge ruled that the Trump administration unlawfully blocked immigration benefits for applicants from 39 countries based on unauthorized anti-immigrant sentiments. The U.S. Supreme Court blocked Alabama's scheduled execution of Jeffrey Lee via nitrogen gas. A federal judge struck down the Trump administration's $100,000 fee on new H-1B visas, ruling it an unlawful tax that lacked congressional authorization. And at least 12 people were injured, 2 critically, during a shootout between 2 individuals at the Old West End Festival in Toledo, Ohio. I am Grace G, and this has been A Moment of News.
All right. Thank you, Grace, for that moment of news. Now it's time for my guest, Crystal FitzSimons. As president of the Food Research and Action Center, Crystal FitzSimons is recognized as a national thought leader on hunger in America and the role federal nutrition programs play in solving it. In her more than 20 years with the organization, most recently as the director of child nutrition programs and policy, FitzSimons has made transformative contributions, including helping to design and implement the after-school supper, summer EBT, and community eligibility programs. She has testified before Congress and led national coalitions. FitzSimons is a sought-after speaker and is also regularly quoted in major media outlets. She holds an MSW degree from Washington University in St. Louis and a BA from Carroll College. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor and privilege to have as a guest on this podcast, Crystal FitzSimons. All right. Crystal FitzSimons. Madam President, how you doing?
I'm good. How are you today?
I'm doing great. I'm doing great. So I understand you've been president of your organization for about a year?
Yeah, and prior to that, I was the interim president, and I've actually been with the Food Research and Action Center, FRAC, for over 25 years. Before I was the president, I was leading our child nutrition work.
Yeah, okay. Well, congratulations. It's still in order in that regard. So what I like to do to start off my interviews is a couple of icebreaker questions. So, or exercises, however you want to do it. My first one, icebreaker, is a quote I want you to respond to. And the quote is, "Hunger is not an issue of charity. It is an issue of justice."
Well, I think that is an amazing quote for us to start our conversation with, because I don't think that hunger is about food. We have plenty of food in the United States to make sure that everybody has access to it. The problem is we don't have the political will. We have economic inequality where we have people living in poverty and we should not have people living in poverty. Hunger is really a symptom of poverty. Families are too stretched trying to make ends meet. And food is the easiest thing to cut. You have to pay your rent. You have to pay your utilities. You need to put gas in your car. You can actually cut back in food. But it really is, hunger is really about the tension that millions of families across the country face in trying to make ends meet and struggling under low wages, high childcare costs, high housing costs, high transportation costs.
Yeah. All right. So now the next icebreaker is what I call 20 questions.
Okay.
So I need you to give me a number between 1 and 20.
12.
What advice do you have for recognizing fake news?
Oh, that's a good question. Gosh, I think, that is a good question. Well, I think you always need to look for the source and where it comes from and if it seems credible. I think, there's been so many attacks on the news, and it really is, I think, a way to attack credibility, to attack people who may have a more progressive view of what's going on. I think journalism actually works really hard to try and tell the story and to be as fair as possible. I think that we have moved as a country away from agreed upon facts. And I think it's an incredible problem when we try to have a conversation. So I would just say people really need to understand where the person who's telling the story is coming from and whether or not they have a real agenda behind them and whether or not what they're saying, is consistent with what they see in what's happening in the world around us right now.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's interesting you picked that question, because I think that is a question that really is important in your line of work. And we're going to address that in the interview. You said, "I've been at FRAC for 27 years, and my passion for food justice overlaps with my passion for achieving economic and social justice. I grew up just outside of Toledo, Ohio, in a household where my mom was passionate about these issues. I remember her telling me that at some point I'd have to explain what I'd done with my life. The message was strong that I needed to work hard to benefit all people, to lift my voice, and not give up when times were hard." So my question to you is, when did you realize your passion specifically for food justice?
Yeah, well, it's funny. I could have, in some ways, when I look back at the history of my career, I feel like I could have worked on other issues too. I could have worked on housing. That's actually where I started, was on housing. I could have worked on, minimum wage. I worked collecting signatures in St. Louis for a minimum wage ballot initiative. So I just see such a huge intersection with food. And part of the reason why I've stayed at FRAC for so long is because I am so passionate about the mission. I do believe that people actually need access to nutritious food to grow and be healthy and thrive in our world. And we really do need to make sure that people's basic needs are being met in order to ensure that they're able to thrive. And it starts with food. But, food is also so much more than just basic needs. It's about community. It's about culture. We all have our favorite foods that we think of that take us back to when, we were growing up or with our friends. And so to me, food is just such a magical thing. And we should be making sure that everybody has access to the food that they need to thrive.
Yeah. So what is FRAC, and why have you devoted nearly 30 years of your life specifically to that organization?
Yeah, well, so FRAC, we're the Food Research and Action Center. We've been around for over 50 years, and we really do focus on the federal nutrition program. So SNAP, which used to be called food stamps, school meals, summer meals, after school meals, WIC, all of those programs kind of as the core support to combating hunger. We're very committed to making sure that people have access to a healthy diet with dignity, and that is a core value at FRAC, and it's very important to me as well. But I just am very proud of all the things that we've accomplished at FRAC during the time that I've been at FRAC. And even before that, we have a pretty incredible track record of moving policy forward, of having a really positive impact on people's lives around the country. And I really see the work that we do as critical, and we are willing to take on a fight. Like right now, we are in the fight of our lives to save SNAP and make sure that the program is available and accessible to everybody who needs it, and also protecting all the other nutrition programs that are somewhat under attack right now. But we do see, when you look at our nation, we do have a series of programs that are designed to ensure that people are not going hungry. We have SNAP to help people purchase food at home, WIC, which is a nutrition prescription to help, pregnant women and young children and infants, grow up healthy. It is, we've got school meals to make sure that kids have access to the nutrition they need at school to focus and concentrate and learn. And the same thing with childcare meals. And we even have programs to fill the gap for kids during the summer with summer food and summer EBT. What worries me these days is that it does feel like the federal government is advocating that commitment. The programs have never been perfect. Like, we could definitely invest more resources. We could make more people eligible for the programs. There's lots of things we could do to improve them. But at the base, we have historically had this commitment to making sure that people are not going hungry in the United States. And it really concerns me, some of the messaging that's coming out of Washington right now and moving away from that federal commitment to make sure that people aren't hungry.
Well, I know FRAC has done a lot and has made a lot of contributions to those programs that you mentioned. My favorite, however, is the fact that this was the organization that basically stopped Ronald Reagan from saying that ketchup and relish were vegetables. I greatly appreciated that because I was in school during that time and I did not want to have hot dogs every day for school lunch. So I thank FRAC for stepping up and doing that. Of the 5 strategic goals for FRAC, which one is the most challenging?
Well, I would say the most challenging is the root causes. I mean, I think all of them can be challenging in their different ways. And I do think at this specific moment in time, we are facing significant challenges in all the areas. But, when people talk about ending hunger, they talk about moving food around sometimes. But we're actually never going to be able to end hunger in the United States unless we end poverty and we address the root causes of hunger. So I just think that is such a harder thing for people to understand. But I do think at this, we are kind of at a crossroads with the federal nutrition programs. I will also say, it's hard to pick one that's the most challenging right now, but, the racial hunger gap is huge. And, FRAC is continuing to talk about racial equity, diversity, and inclusion. We think it's a really important conversation to be having, particularly when, nationally 1 in 7 households are struggling with food insecurity, but that number is 1 in 4 for Black households, and it's 1 in 5 for Latino households. And if we're going to solve hunger, we have to be talking about how it disproportionately impacts different communities.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, all those goals are lofty, and just looking at them, but the reducing the racial hunger gap probably would, if I was in your position, I would think that would probably be the toughest one, because there's so many factors outside of that. But since you brought it up, what are the root causes for hunger in America?
Yeah, well, I mean, we seem to be okay as a country with having incredible economic inequality, and it's just gotten worse. Like, I remember when I was in school back in the 80s, I was a sociology philosophy major, and in sociology, we learned that the highest paid employee in a company was making 66 times what the lowest paid employee was making. And now, you fast forward 30 years and that number has, increased exponentially. Like, the difference between what people are making, the vast majority of people in this country are making, versus the top 10% is just shocking. It's not okay, but it is a big driver. And then you start with wages and people not making enough, not having livable wages. And then you move on to the fact that housing costs have gone up significantly. Childcare costs are astronomical. And you've got food costs have risen. So there's all this tremendous pressure that is being placed on families across the country. But it really, people have lots of different conversations about the poor and poverty and all of that. And what makes somebody poor is the fact that they don't have any money. Like, that is it. And we need to make sure that families have the resources that they need to be able to have safe and stable housing, to be able to purchase the food that they need, to be able to kind of focus on raising their kids and taking care of their loved ones and leaning into their community, as opposed to being stressed and stretched and struggling to put food on the table.
Yeah. And, this is not a modern phenomenon. This has basically been going on throughout the history of this country. I think about 2 things. One, I read once that a reporter asked Andrew Carnegie, why do you give so much money in charity, but you don't give a raise to your workers? And he said, it's like, if I control the money, so I do things to try to help the community and all that. But if I just gave it to the workers, all they would do is just buy more meat. And I always found that to be a striking thing. And then I watched Theodore Roosevelt, the documentary on him that the History Channel did. I think it was History Channel. And there was a moment during his administration where he reformed food safety, right? He was, watching what was going on in places. He sent people out to Chicago and other places, stockyards, to see how they were processing meat and realized what they were doing. And so he invited Mr. Swift and all these other people to the White House to have dinner, and he had a steak dinner. And, he had somebody give the report while they were eating the steak, and all of them just kind of pushed their plates away, and, so food, not only is the wages, which I was highlighting with Carnegie, but it's also the safety factor too. A lot of people are not getting the right food and all that. And that contributes to hunger too, right? It's like the malnutrition piece of it.
Yeah. And I do think the core of that is having more resources to purchase food, because when people have more money to purchase food, they tend to purchase healthier food. And that is a big driver. I mean, it's not an accident when you look at health that more affluent people tend to have better health, and it starts with what they're able to purchase in the grocery store. And people who are struggling are making, I mean, it's amazing the math and mental calculations that are happening in the grocery store when people are there making sure that they're purchasing food to feed their families, because prices have gone up so high on so many different things. We have this huge affordability crisis that almost everyone is facing in this country, and it's making it really difficult for people to purchase healthy food. But one of the easiest ways to improve the nutrition quality of what people buy in the grocery store is to give them more resources to purchase more fruits and vegetables, more lean meats, more whole grains, all of those things that come together into a healthy diet.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I have to, watch, what I got in the cupboard. I'm just me. And, I have to watch what I got in cupboard. It's like I drink a lot of juices. So I got a budget that's like, okay, it's like if I get these juices, that's going to be X amount of dollars and all that stuff. And I'm not saying that, you know, we got to, there's no desire for everybody to be extravagant in what they buy, but it should not, like you said, all this mental gymnastics to figure out what I need to take care of my family of 3, 4, 5, 6 people, right? America shouldn't be in that situation, but let's get back to FRAC for just a second. What is FRAC's relationship with the Coalition of Human Needs?
Oh, we love the Coalition on Human Needs. Actually, our Chief Government Affairs Officer is the board chair for them. They do incredible work, and they work on all the different issues. So we're a very active partner of theirs.
Yeah. One of the cool things about doing this podcast is that you find out stuff. And, I've been a privilege to be an elected official and all that. And I have never heard of this organization. And I'm sitting there going, so there's a group where everybody that deals with, basic human needs, the Maslow pyramid, there's a coalition where they all get together and meet. I was like, oh God, I wish I had known that a couple, about 20 years ago when I was elected. I could have tapped into them for a lot of stuff. And probably a lot of the work that they do, I probably was getting, but I was getting it from another source. So when I found that out, I was like, that's really fascinating, that this group, and that I think they're getting new leadership too, as far as executive director and all that. But I just thought that was kind of cool that there is actually a group of people who meet that's trying to address the issues that humans basically need. I think that's great.
Yeah, no, we're huge fans, and they convene all the different groups every week, have lots of conversations, share information. But yeah, they're fantastic. And yeah, Debbie, their executive director, who's been there for a long time, I don't know exactly the number, is just an icon in our community. They're going to be celebrating her at their Heroes Award in July. So I'm looking forward to being there and celebrating all her great work.
Yeah, that's cool. It's also kind of cool that one of your coworkers is the chairman of the board. I think that helps out a lot too. How has ending the household food security report impacted your work?
Well, so it hasn't actually impacted our work yet, because they're always a year delay in the data. So they actually released the data just before the new year for the last round. So that was delayed a couple months, but they've announced that they aren't going to put out data moving forward. Normally we would get it in the fall, but it is an absolute disaster to end this measure. It is the gold standard for understanding what people are facing as far as getting food on the table, who's impacted, the impact of the federal nutrition programs. It really does help drive kind of policy thinking and really just understand what's going on. Last summer, Congress and the president signed it. They passed this bill called H.R. 1 that just made a tremendous amount of cuts to the SNAP program, to Medicaid, and it is going to have a huge impact on people's health and well-being. And the food security measure, I think, is a really important measure to understand how that's playing out so that we can respond to it. And canceling it just hides the impact. And, we need to be focused on making sure that everybody has enough to eat. And if we don't have a measure to truly understand it and to truly understand the struggle that so many households face, like I said, it's 1 in 7 across the country. It's really hard to figure out how to respond. And so back in the 80s, we did do the ketchup as a vegetable piece and were able to successfully have that not counted as a vegetable. But one of the other things that we worked on before I got to FRAC was kind of the food security measure. Reagan said there was his administration was saying that there was no hunger. And we were like, yes, there is. And people were standing in line for food. And so we actually developed the Community Childhood Hunger Identification Project, where we went out, worked with community groups to go out, developed a measure of questions to figure out food security and how much people were struggling. And that, was one of the precursors to the food security measure. So we understand how important it is to know and track how people are struggling to put food on the table. And we are continuing to call on Congress to reverse that. We are trying to get Congress to include funding and tell USDA that they need to reinstate the food security measure so that we can really track this. And it's not expensive. I think it's less than $2 million. So when you think of all the funding that goes into anti-hunger programs and anti-poverty programs and all the decisions that get made at the federal level, to be operating blind without really understanding food security and the struggle that people face, it does not make any sense at all.
Yeah. So is that part of the Restoring Food Security for American Families and Farmers Act, what you're talking about?
No, actually, the Restoring Food Security for a Family, and I'm probably butchering the name, that is to reverse all of the cuts that they made to SNAP in the budget reconciliation law that they passed last summer. And so last summer, they cut SNAP by $186 billion over 10 years. And they did it through a number of different ways. But that bill would reverse those cuts, which have already led to millions of people losing their SNAP benefits. And we expect that number to continue to grow as the cuts continue to roll out across the country.
Yeah, I think Senator Lujan from New Mexico, I think he was one of the sponsors of that. So in New Mexico, y'all hear that? Y'all need to reelect that guy because he's trying to feed folks. What is the progress of that act, the Healthy School Meals for All legislation, and efforts to maintain funding for SNAP and WIC programs? You've kind of touched on it in different answers, but overall, what is Miss Ellen going through in trying to lobby Congress?
Yeah, no, it's a lot of work right now. But the thing that I think is really interesting, because I've been at FRAC for a long time, is that I think most people share the vision that they want people in this country to have what they need to thrive. And I do think we need to figure out a way to move people back to that vision that we do share. I mean, people want the best for kids. They want the best for seniors. They don't want people to be going hungry in this country. And I think we need to move back to that. But for the HR 1 piece, I mean, that was such a huge cut. I mean, it was unprecedented, the attack on SNAP. And it really changes kind of the structure in some ways. It could lead some states to drop out. So what's happening in Congress right now is that they have a farm bill that passed out of the House and just for people who don't track anti-hunger policy, the SNAP program is actually part of the farm bill. So that passed out of the House. They didn't reverse any of the cuts that we were calling for. The Senate, it looks like it could be different. The Senate Agriculture Committee, Chairman Bozeman is getting ready to release his bill actually in the next few days, I think, or it could slip till next week. Things do slip sometimes in D.C. But the Democrats on the committee have drawn a line in the sand and said that they're not going to support a bill unless it does something to address the SNAP cuts. So there is conversation around reversing kind of these cost shifts that make it harder for states to run the program and again, would be a huge financial burden on states. We've been lifting up time limits to try and reverse that or give some support there. But those are kind of the two things that we've really been focused on and see maybe an opportunity on. The food insecurity piece is part of the appropriations process. And then the other piece that you talked about, the healthy school meals for all, which is actually what I think about when I want to have a little bit of hope right now, because it feels like everywhere you look, there is a challenge coming at you and people are not being treated the way they should be treated. Healthy school meals for all is kind of that shining light. I've been working on that for more than a decade, and we have slowly increased the number of schools that offer free meals to all students. And we have 9 states that do that for all their schools. Over half the schools across the country are offering free meals to all the students. And it's an incredible way to reduce the stigma of participating in school meals, because we see kids who are eligible for free or reduced price meals drop out of the program as they get older, as they start to see it as more of a program for poor kids. So making sure that it's accessible to everybody, I think, is a really important piece. It's kind of like a release valve for household food budgets, because parents can count on breakfast and lunch for their kids 180 days out of the year, which dramatically reduces their food costs. It's easier for administrators. They don't have as much paperwork. And then you also have teachers and superintendents who really love it because they know that kids are coming to the class well-nourished and ready to learn. So we're continuing to work on that. We think more states will take it up, and we are calling on the federal government to move in that direction for school meals. But when I feel I'm looking for a little hope in this world, I think about healthy school meals for all. And I also think about all the positive polling, because it is a very simple thing to understand, and most people do support it. We've seen polls as high as 80% of voters that support it, and even in some red states. So I think it's really something that we should be rallying around and celebrating.
Yeah, I grew up in Chicago, and it was like they offered breakfast and lunch, and I wasn't one of the free lunch kids. I had to pay, I think it was like 40 cents for like lunch. And, you used to get into fights. People tried to take your lunch money. It's like, really?
Right.
But, it was, when I look back of my childhood, it was just kind of like understood. It was like you got there in time for breakfast, because a lot of parents, even if they could afford it, it was like it was a matter of time because both of them had to work. So it was kind of like, all right. And we didn't have school buses in Chicago. So elementary school, you had to walk to school. So it was like, hey, you got to get out, especially when it's cold, because I got to put all these layers on you and get to the school so you can get you something to eat. You know what I'm saying? Some mornings. So it was just there for us. And then, of course, lunch was always the standard, but it just never dawned on me until I got into adulthood and got into politics. That was like, so not every child in America is getting breakfast and lunch at school. That's crazy, so it's just amazing when you grow up. I told one of my professors, I was like, I should be mad at y'all because y'all didn't tell us that adulthood was like this. That was the one thing you didn't tell us about the world. Speaking of which, why do you think that some lawmakers lack the understanding and compassion to address hunger in America? And what can be done to fix that?
Well, I think, sometimes I actually really do not understand why people don't support it. It's one of the things with the healthy school meals for all so that's been a long journey for schools and for FRAC. And before the pandemic hit, because when the pandemic hit, schools across the country all were able to offer free meals to all their students. Before the pandemic hit, I would get a call probably like every month. There was some child in school who had their lunch taken away and thrown into the trash because they had unpaid school meal debt. And it's just horrible, horrible situation. That absolutely should not happen to any child. I have got 2 kids. They just, that is like the worst message you could send to a child. We'd rather put the food in the trash than let you eat it. I mean, seriously. And then you've got school nutrition folks who really don't want to be doing that. And you've got school boards who, are really struggling with this unpaid school meal debt and trying to figure out how to solve it. So it's not a great situation. And people were absolutely outraged, as they should be, when that happened. And, I could tell lots of stories of other things that happened to kids who had unpaid school meal debt. But people really seem to understand how problematic that was. And I've never understood, which is true, and it's outrageous and problematic. And I've, worked very hard to reverse that and to make sure that schools are focusing any efforts to collect school meal fees to the parents, not the kids. But at the same time, the same people who are outraged by that are totally fine, with 14 million kids growing up in households where they don't have the money to purchase food. So that disconnect, I really don't understand. I do think that there are plenty of politicians and policymakers who do care, but they don't think that we should be spending the money on it, and they worry about that. But I actually think those dollars are best invested in making sure that people have access to healthy food and are, have access to health care and the things they need to be able to thrive.
Yeah, that could be a whole other podcast, my thoughts on that. I just, I never understood colleagues that would be like, well, we can't afford that. And my argument has always been, no, you don't want to prioritize that. It's like whatever money, and I was an elected official in Mississippi, the quote unquote poorest state in the nation. And, but even the poorest state in the nation, we had a $10 billion budget. You know what I'm saying? So for 3 million people, it seems like needs could be met if you prioritize them. So, that to me has always been the thing. It's not so much affordability on the government end. It's about prioritization. And, until we can get a mindset as far as like basic needs should be a priority, regardless of what level of government you're in, it to me is always going to be a struggle, which leads me to this. Albert Einstein once said, an empty stomach is not a good political advisor. Do you agree with that statement?
Oh, I would absolutely agree with that statement. I mean, when people have an empty stomach, they can't focus, they can't concentrate, they can't learn. It is just so basic. Parents, I think one of the best things you can do for kids is make sure parents aren't parenting hungry. The workforce is much more productive if everybody has food in their belly. We know that kids can't learn if they're hungry. It doesn't make any sense to let people walk around needing food.
Yeah. Yeah. Amen to that. All right, Crystal, finish this sentence. I have hope because.
I have hope because I've seen how committed people are to making sure that others have what they need. I have hope because I think we ultimately are going to win this fight, even though it's taking way too long. And I have hope because there's no reason why we can't win. We all just need to be all in on it.
Yeah. Well, Crystal FitzSimons, I'm Christian by faith, and so in the Black church, we always have this saying that, when people are doing what needs to be done in the community, we say you're doing the Lord's work. In the Jewish faith, there's a belief that there are 36 spirits that come up in every generation. And those 36 people, you won't know them until you see their deeds and their actions. I tend to believe there's more than 36. I don't know why in the Jewish faith they've limited to 36, but I would say that you and the people that you work fall into that category because, it's mind-boggling to me that in the richest nation in the world, people go to sleep hungry. And just the fact that there are warriors like you out here to hold us accountable to that, I greatly appreciate that. So I wanted to say that to you. But more importantly, I wanted to, just thank you for being committed to what your mom had said about being involved in social justice. If people want more information about FRAC or people want to reach out to you, how can they do that?
Yeah, so we do have a website, frac.org, frac.org, and we have most of our resources on it. The one thing I would say, Erik, is if people are committed to ending hunger in the United States, we actually have lots of resources at FRAC to weigh in with policymakers and communicate your thoughts. And you can easily find that on our Action Center on our website. Definitely all of our information is on the website. I'm always happy to connect with people and to also make sure that people get to the right person at FRAC if they want to talk about school meals or child nutrition or WIC or SNAP. Always can make sure that we make those connections for people, and you can always donate to FRAC. My comms director would actually kill me if I didn't say that, and our development director as well. But because it is a little harder to raise funding for advocacy work, but it is so important because just to give you an example, for every one meal that's provided by a food bank, SNAP provides 9. So, we need to be fighting the good fight, making sure that we have a public commitment to ending hunger in the United States. And that really is the core work of FRAC.
Yeah. And it was some other stat that I saw where it's like for every dollar that's invested in food, that's an extra $1.08 that goes out to the community for economic development and all that. So yeah, it just makes sense. But look, I could talk about this forever. You're a busy woman and all that. So again, I want to thank you for your time and thank you for coming on the podcast. Crystal FitzSimons, again, I mean it when I say that you're doing great work and I appreciate the fact that you have dedicated most of your adult life to doing this kind of work.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me on. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Yes, ma'am. All right, guys, and we're going to catch y'all on the other side. All right, and we are back. And so now it is time for my next guest, Pauline Steinhorn. Pauline Steinhorn enjoys telling other people's stories. Throughout her career as an award-winning filmmaker and writer, she has written and directed documentaries for PBS, Maryland Public Television, Sesame Street, Discovery Channel, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, the Smithsonian, and the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Her articles and essays have appeared in the Wall Street Journal and Moment magazine. She is the author of the book, Dreaming of the River, A Mother and Daughter's Fight for Survival During the Holocaust. And we're going to talk about that book during the interview. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor and privilege to have as a guest on this podcast, Pauline Steinhorn. All right. Pauline Steinhorn. How you doing, ma'am? You doing good?
I'm doing great. How are you today?
I'm doing lovely, and I'm really glad to have you on. We're going to talk about your book, Dreaming of the River. And it sounds like this great romance novel and all this stuff, but it's a little deeper than that. But we'll get into that as we have the discussion. I'll do a couple of icebreakers first. The first icebreaker is a quote I want you to respond to. And the quote is, "The lessons of the Holocaust are not Jewish, but universal. And unfortunately, the lessons remain relevant today."
I agree. And that's one of the reasons it was important to me to publish this book right now. One of the big lessons of the Holocaust, and one that I was told from a very young age, was this concept of turning a group into the other. We're all the same. My mother would sit me down at the table at the beginning of every school year, and she said, "Is there anyone in your class who looks different, sounds different, and who doesn't have anyone to sit with in the cafeteria or play with in the playground. We're all the same. You know how to be a friend and a good neighbor. Go make friends with them. And I wish that that was the motto of the world, because right now we're blaming problems on the wrong places, on people and groups, when the problems have nothing to do with immigrants or with other people who are coming to this country or who have been here their whole lives. And that's one of the lessons that I think we need to take from the Holocaust. And the other is that it's very easy for authoritarian leaders to 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 blame our problems on these other groups. And I see that happening all over the world.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a problem of accountability. I think it's the older I get, the more I realize it's not just a simple, I hate you, right? Or I'm not comfortable with you. It's like, I can't accept the fact that I am not worthy of doing, or I don't have the ability to do something. So I've got to find a reason why I can't do that. And so I scapegoat. And that's really where the power of otherism is. And we can go off on a whole tangent of that, but let's get back with my next icebreaker, which is 20 questions. Give me a number between 1 and 20.
1 and 20. Okay. 17.
Okay. What's something about people who see the world differently than you that you've come to appreciate?
I appreciate the fact that by engaging in a conversation with that person or those people, that I can expand my understanding of the world and my understanding of other people. I don't want to judge people by their political opinions. It's very easy to do that, but I want to stay open-minded.
Yeah, my daddy had, he had a few sayings, and one of the things he used to say was, a broken clock tells the time right twice a day. And
Yes.
the lesson was that somebody that you may not agree with, somebody that you think you have nothing in common, every now and then it's like, that makes sense. But we automatically tune them out because they're different, right? So,
Right.
yeah, I appreciate that. So, Dreaming of the River is a story of Bronia. Am I saying that right?
Yes.
Bronia Feldman and her daughter, Hajuta.
Hayuta,
Hayuta.
the Polish. That's right.
Okay. Bronia Feldman and her daughter, Hayuta. How did you come across their story?
I had heard my mother's stories my whole life. When I was very young, a woman came to the house who I didn't know, dressed in a business suit, and that was very rare. I don't think that ever happened. And she came and sat down at the kitchen table, and my mother sent the children, there were 3 of us, downstairs to our playroom and said, "Don't come up until I tell you to." And she closed the door, and she never closed the door on us. She also never told us not to come up. So curious me, at about maybe, 6, 7 years old, I climbed to the top of the stairs and I sat and listened. And what I heard were adventure stories, to my young mind. I didn't hear about the violence. I only heard about my grandmother escaping from her slave labor camp and my mother being hidden under trash by someone when she was sick. And this young girl, Lita, my mother's sister, escaping from the ghetto to bring her food. And I thought, wow, what an adventurous time. And I read everything I could find about the Holocaust. I would go to the library and sit on the floor and read Mila 16, which I wasn't allowed to take out of the library. And fortunately, I didn't understand much of what was said, but it just sounded like a great adventure to me. My mother became a Holocaust educator. She got her degree in education with a focus on the Holocaust. And she started going into classrooms and talking about it. And when as an as a teenager and a young adult, when I heard her stories, I finally understood the gravity of what had happened. My mother had been working on a memoir based on the journal she wrote in 1945, right after she was liberated. And at the end of her life, she told me her only regret was not completing her memoir, and I promised to finish it for her. And so for the last 6 months of her life, we talked about these stories. I read them all. I knew most of them. And I asked questions and I took notes, and she kept writing. And when she passed away, my youngest brother and I packed up 12 boxes of papers, research, writings, poems, plays that she had written that were published. And I started right in. At a certain point, I realized I can't do this part-time. And so I left my job and started writing. And a year later, I went through, every few months I'd go through the boxes and see what I could find. Initially, I just grabbed the most recent, typed memoir with a date. And a year later, I found my grandmother's journals that she had translated from Polish into English. And boy, what a story I heard. This was no longer the young teen, age 13 to 16 in the camps being saved by other people and cheering up her friends, but a young woman who committed sabotage and had 3 children, one of whom was a mile away in another labor camp. And she enlisted the help of her Polish Christian friends to smuggle medicine into the labor camp because she was a nurse and she could help the other prisoners. And I'm still blown away by some of the stories that are in this book. And it's also interesting what stands out for other people about these stories that I've written, or that I should say I've added notes, I edited their language and put them together in what I believe is an original way.
Well, somebody, I think the person that wrote one of the forwards compared what you did to like Beethoven. I guess
Yeah.
the ghost trio or whatever it is. I was more of a Bach guy than a Beethoven guy, but just the way you compose that and intertwine them was so unique and powerful in the sense, because it was like a timeline kind of deal, but it was synchronized and all that. It's really powerful. And for the listeners, say your mom's name again.
Hayuta and Branya, my grandmother.
Yeah. So Hayuta was the mom that Miss
was my mom, the teenager.
Yeah.
Hayuta's the teenager.
And Branya was the grandmama, and they changed their names when they got over here. So your grandma became Brenda.
That's right.
And your mom became Harriet.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. But we're going by their native Polish names in the book. What was the significance of the book's title to you?
I think that the river, which was right outside their back door when my mom was growing up, became a symbol for both of them of the life they hoped to return to. They dreamed of being with their family again and swimming in the river and having big picnic dinners along the river to celebrate birthdays and holidays, and everyone would bring their instruments. And it was a really lovely time for the family. For my mother, it was also one of the reasons that she survived. She was living in the ghetto for 2 years. She wanted to go back to the river, but she wasn't allowed to. She hated being in the ghetto and confined in this small space that was very crowded. And so she begged my grandmother, who at that time was working as a day laborer in a munitions factory. She was working in the gardens. My mother begged her to go in her place. My mother thought, working in the gardens, sounds easy compared to being stuck here in the ghetto. And I would get to walk along the river. I would get to walk a kilometer past my old house, and I would love that. And one day, Hayuta's youngest sister came home in tears, inconsolable, because some boys said they're going to kill all the children under 10. And my grandmother, Branya, realized she had to stay home with her the next day just to reassure her that life would be fine. And she allowed my mother to go in her place and take her ID badge. Months later, when the ghetto was liquidated, everyone was sent to Treblinka who was left in the ghetto. My mother was in a labor camp. My grandmother was in another labor camp. She had been arrested. If they had been in the ghetto, they would have gone to Treblinka, and very few people survived Treblinka. So it's the reason my mother survived.
Yeah. And it really, your mom's recollections of the river, just the initial entries that she made in her journal set the tone. And it was one of the fascinating things about the book, their perspectives, because here you had this grown woman, she was a mother, talking about your grandmother, and, and trying to convince her husband, shouldn't we be paying attention to what's going on, and, and all this stuff. And then you've got the child who's like, I like sitting out and looking at the river. I like going out on the beach. I remember swinging on the rope and falling into, just the child's mindset about playing and not even connecting the dots until bam, it hits home. What were your thoughts as you were lining those stories up, those journals together?
My mother did write her journals at 16 with a childlike wonder. And that childlike wonder continued throughout her book, too. She had a boyfriend in a labor camp. She wrote about boys. She has this boyfriend, and then there's another boy who's much more handsome than my boyfriend, and he wants to walk with me on Sundays, our day off, and maybe I should walk with him. But what will my boyfriend think? And I thought, goodness, that could be my high school diary. And so she's still living a life and being a human being. And she and the other young women in the barracks swapped recipes and mimed how they made certain foods, even though they were starving. And there was a boy who read poetry on Sundays and had memorized Midsummer Night's Dream and spoke, recited some of that. My grandmother didn't write about any of this, and at that point, they were together in the same camp. So there was a difference between the brutality and the realization that my grandmother, Branya, had that she may have lost all of her loved ones except her daughter, and my mother's reality that I'll just make it through today. My friends will be here. We'll help each other, and we'll get through this. It was fascinating to see those points of view side by side.
So one of the characters, even though these were real people, it was like, in a story form, they're characters. And your grandfather was a very interesting character. Why do you think he remained optimistic even as he saw the terror being afflicted upon them daily?
He was a Marxist and belonged to the Marxist Labor Party. And he really believed that the Allies would come to their aid and they would get through this, and that he and his comrades in, these freedom fighter groups throughout Poland that were aligned with this Marxist party, they believed that they could rebuild Poland and rebuild it that would get closer to a socialist state. And they wanted to be there to rebuild Poland. And many of the relatives and friends left in time, but he was such an optimist and he wanted to stay. And my grandmother, she was a housewife. And at that time period in the 30s, you let your husband make the final decisions. And so what I saw also in her life throughout this time period is a transformation for her in becoming her own agent and operating the way she wanted to and becoming a healer in the camps and fighting to save people. And she still, throughout her life, she talked about her husband. Even though she remarried, she still spoke very kindly about Pincus and his idealism.
Yeah. I think it was one point, I guess maybe close to the end. It may have been in the middle somewhere, but it was one point where she said, well, Pincus would have said something to try to get something done, so let me say something, right? Let me use my voice. So I thought that was interesting. Like you said, it was just you could see the transformations as they were dealing with this stuff every day. So as you were reading, translating, and editing these journals, what was more emotional for you, their depictions of Nazi cruelty or their resilience and ingenuity?
I think what was most emotional to me was how much people maintained their humanity and helped each other survive. I think that the people who survived had two things going for them. One was a great deal of luck, and another thing was keeping their humanity. Viktor Frankl wrote a book about man's search for meaning, and he was a psychiatrist before the war. He was in Auschwitz. And when he was in Auschwitz, he noticed that some people died and others didn't. And the people who died could have been stronger, they could have been healthier, but they had given up. So he started talking to the prisoners and asking them every night. Someone who seemed like they were on the verge of giving up, he'd say to that person, what do you have to look forward to when the war is over? What purpose do you have in life that you want to continue? What work do you want to finish when you leave here? And I believe that he really had something, and that means so much to me that my grandmother had a purpose in life to save other people, and my mother's purpose was to be together with her family. And every time they talked about that, and then they wrestled with God, that was a surprise to me too. That meant a lot to me and was very emotional for me to read about people who risked their lives to save others.
Yeah. So what is it like to be the child of a Holocaust survivor, especially in this current American political climate?
For many years, I didn't want to think about the Holocaust because it was too painful to think about. Whenever my mom would talk about it, her face would change. And so that was painful to see. It's very hard in this political environment. First of all, it's hard to be Jewish and to be proud of being Jewish right now because of all the rising anti-Semitism. And it's also hard to see this administration and the lack of humanity I see in how they approach problems. I mean, we talked about that a little bit earlier. But I also have taken on my mother's legacy of sharing these stories, and I never thought I would do that. And I might not have done that if it wasn't for this particular time. I especially enjoy speaking to middle school and high school students and telling my mother's story because I believe that they're the future of this country and college students. And if I can encourage them to stop this otherism and to see each other as equal, then I believe we can change the world.
Yeah. So your mother was 16 when she and your grandmother were liberated from Bergen-Belsen.
Yes.
And you stated that your mom would go on to be a Holocaust educator, giving public talks at schools and synagogues. But your grandmother never spoke of her experiences, not even privately. Why do you think there was a difference there? Why do you think your mom was more of an activist and your grandma was kind of like, yeah, that's just a part of my life I don't talk about?
I think there are two reasons. I've heard many Holocaust survivors say, I don't want you to know what I went through and what your family went through. It's too painful for you to think about. And then it's too painful for me to think about. My mother became a very religious Jew, and she had an interesting meaning of God. My grandmother didn't believe in God because God took so many of her people, even though in the book she thanks God for saving her daughter. And, I think it was very hard for my grandmother. My grandmother continued nursing. She worked at the Hebrew Home, which was a part of Sinai Hospital in Baltimore. And she especially liked working with immigrants and refugees. And she felt like that was her calling. But you're right. She didn't want to talk about it. I discovered later that I have a cousin who's 8 years older than I am, who she did talk about it. And it may have been in talking to my aunt and uncle. They spoke in Yiddish and I never learned Yiddish. So that may be how my cousin knew some of these stories. But I think my grandmother was trying to protect us.
Yeah. Yeah. And that sounds like, the generational kind of thing, because it wasn't until I got older that my dad would share some of his experiences. He was 2 when he left Mississippi, but he said they used to go back like in the summers and work. And, it was like growing up in Chicago, I didn't relate to any of that, and he didn't feel any need to really talk about it. And then, as I got older, then he would tell me these stories, or we see some on TV and he would say, yeah, I remember when they stopped us at the border. I was like, what? You know what I'm saying? And so it's like, it was just kind of like, had to pry it out of him. And then of course, when I got into politics in Mississippi, it was like, oh, it's obviously different now. If you can run for office down there. So, and then my mom, who always seemed like she was happy with everybody, then she started sharing some stuff. And I was like, really? It's just amazing, all of these stories that are in all of our families. And to be honest, Miss Pauline, I'm a little jealous of you because you were able to get that and be able to put it out in the book and all that stuff. There's so many relatives that I wish I had that foresight and just got a recorder and went to work. But I'm really, really, really honored that you did that, because that story always needs to be told.
And I hope that you will tell the stories that you do have to your children and to other people. It's important for all of us to hear those stories.
Oh yeah. Yeah. It's like my child and my child grew up in Mississippi and now they're in Chicago. And yeah. So, a lot of the stories I told was about growing up in Chicago. So of course there were questions like, is it safe if I'm in this neighborhood? Oh yeah, you're fine. You're good. That kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Your mom said, my fear and that of other Holocaust survivors is that the world has not learned from the genocide of 6 million Jews. We must do everything we can to encourage tolerance and respect towards those who are different from us. I have been privileged to share my family's story about the dangers of fascism, anti-Semitism, and genocide in the hope that learning this history will prevent others from repeating it. Was that a motivating factor to make sure that Bronia's and Hajuta's story was told?
Yes. Although genocides never stopped. They've been happening all over the world. And I wish there was more that I could do to stop it, but I hope that in my small way I'm contributing.
Yeah, yeah. So finish this sentence for me. I have hope because.
I have hope because of the response that I've gotten from my book and the amazing response and letters I've received from young people who I speak to in high schools. I've received letters talking about intolerance and wanting to be more more tolerant and more involved in social justice. A friend whose daughter graduated from high school wrote a letter to me thanking me for telling my story. And she and the other students from her class, one of them shared this, not the story about me, but their hope for the future of living in a world where there's no prejudice, more tolerance, no racism, no otherism. And I hope that I'm contributing to that.
Yeah, well, Pauline Steinhorn, you definitely are. And I think that, when I first was approached to having you on, I remember going to Washington, D.C. and going to the Holocaust Museum. And if I forget as I get older stuff, I will never forget the exhibit of the shoes, right? And there's a moment in the book where, the shoes of your grandmother was very, very important. I want people to read the books. I ain't going to tell the story, but I just remember seeing all of those shoes lined up, and that will leave a lasting impression on me. And then the other thing is at the museum, you get a little passport, and you have this person, and you go through the whole museum, and then at the end you'll see if you survived or not. Right.
Right.
And like you said, those stories need to be told, because just like there's people that don't believe it actually happened. And I can't conceive how people think like that. But as long as there's a Pauline Steinhorn out there doing the kind of work and telling the stories, then we will continue to have the hope. And like you said, those young people that gravitated to the book. And so speaking about that, how can people get the book? How can people reach out to you?
I have a website, paulinesteinhorn.net, and there's an email. My email address is on there, and you can purchase the book on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and through your local bookstore. Many of the local bookstores in my area are carrying it. I live outside of Washington, D.C., and I hope that if you go to your independent bookstore, they'll order it for you.
Yeah. And I encourage people, if you've never read anything other than maybe a Wikipedia page or something you remembered from your high school history or college history class, I need you to read this book, because when you have a real life account, when you have somebody that documented what they went through, you can appreciate it better and understand the magnitude of, in this case, a tragedy that turned triumphant because they survived, right? But, to me, it's always going to be hard to believe that people can be that cruel. And so you have to be reminded of that in order to make sure that we do better generation after generation after generation. So Pauline Steinhorn, thank you so much for writing the book. Thank you so much for being obedient to your heart to put that thing together. And I thank you for coming on the podcast and sharing. I hate that we've got a limit in time, because you can only scratch the surface, but then I want people to read the book, so I can't tell everything anyway. But I really thank you for taking the time to talk about the book today.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
All right, guys, and we're going to catch y'all on the other side. All right, and we are back. So it is time for my next guest, Dehjah Vaughn. Dehjah Vaughn is an educator, podcaster, PhD candidate, thought-provoking speaker, and creative writer. Her work is centered around promoting Black consciousness and entrepreneurship, with the motive to shift the narrative through highlighting exceptional achievements of our brothers and sisters across the diaspora. Her ambition is to reveal facets of Black liberation by employing research analytics, both qualitative and quantitative data analysis, and through written expression. She contends that it is crucial to recognize the influence of political psychology on Black individuals, asserting that such an understanding will furnish essential tools for comprehensive mental and emotional upliftment. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor and privilege to have as a guest on this podcast, Dehjah Vaughn. All right. Dehjah Vaughn, how you doing?
I'm doing well. I can't complain. The sun is out. Saturday. It feels good.
Well, it's an honor to have you on. You had reached out to me, I guess, a couple of years ago. And, I think might have been longer than that, though, now that I think about it, because you were trying to get your podcast started and
Yes.
you were excited to network with somebody. And I felt really flattered about that you thought I was somebody that you could get some wisdom from. So when I was really excited when you accepted my invitation to be a guest, because I've listened to your podcast ever since and just kind of followed you because we were on LinkedIn together. And I think we were about to have a really good discussion. So if you're ready, we'll go ahead and get that discussion going.
Let's get it going.
All right. So normally how I start off the interviews is that I do a couple of icebreakers. And the first icebreaker I want you to respond to is a quote. And the quote is, I define success as the motivation to get up in the morning. I can describe it as what is your why? I feel like once I identified what my why was, I felt more inclined to wake up on time or get up early in the morning because I was driven by success. I loved the way it felt to get things accomplished, the things that made me feel good. Whether if the feeling was how something makes me feel or how something makes someone else feel. In those moments, I feel aligned to my purpose, and I would consider my purpose as success.
That's a deep one. It makes me think of so many different people, and I think the person that quoted that is on the tip of my tongue, but I don't really recall, but I do remember the impact of the quote and the intentionality of what it means to wake up every morning and know what you are doing and who you are doing it for. Yeah, that's how I would categorize that quote. But who is the individual that wrote that?
I'll give you a hint. It's somebody that you see every morning.
I'm like, wow. I'm like, that's me?
That's you. You said that. Yeah. It's pretty heavy when you hear your words back to you, isn't it?
Yes, very much so.
Yeah.
Very much so.
See, but that just proves my point, how profound you are, right? All right. So now the next icebreaker is what I call 20 questions. So I need you to give me a number between 1 and 20.
11.
All right. Where do you go to check a fact that you see, hear, or read?
Where do I go? Wow. I think the first way that is coming up for me is I usually type in Google the theme of the fact, and I look through reputable sources, whether it's an org or .gov will be my preferred method, especially if this research is pertaining to something that is within academia, but not just in academia either. And in the literature that I am writing on my own, it's important that even if I'm reading something from a Dr. Claude Anderson or reading something from a Dr. Francis Cress Welsing, I'm still taking that and expounding on that, because a lot of times people can create a discussion around statistics, but it is not the actual logistics or the foundational pieces of why something is. Basically creating their own understanding of what they have understood about numerical data or qualitative research or quantitative research, whatever that is. So I usually look at that, but I also too look at other scholarly works to see their opinions on sites like a JSTOR or those type of databases that have journal articles of other researchers that may have a different opinion upon what is being presented to them as well. And then for a larger notion, I take it internally and I ask myself, do I believe in this? Because I also too believe that sometimes the questions that we have are already within us, but have we taken enough time to be able to figure that out? Have we been able to ask ourselves questions out loud and answer back out loud? I think it's very important, at least to my own personal matriculation in life. I have realized that it is so important for my own balance to be able to ask myself questions too.
Okay. So talk to the listeners about the path that led you to pursue a doctorate in political science.
Wow. Yes. So I just had completed my master's at University of Pacific. And I was like, there's a next step that I want to take. We were just coming off of the ends of COVID, and I felt pretty much radicalized from that experience in COVID, especially politically about what I wanted to see in terms of change, or just better yet, comprehension of the political system in general. So the institution that I sought was Clark Atlanta. And I was so intentional about getting to Clark Atlanta. I saved X amount of dollars. I had a tutor for me for my writing, for my personalized statement, for my resume, for my writing sample. I was super intentional because I felt like I deserved to put that energy into something that I wanted to see. I wanted to foresee for myself. So once I got to Atlanta, mind you, I never been to Atlanta before. I think the one time that I was in Atlanta, I was traveling with my grandfather from Virginia to drop off my uncle in Atlanta, but I don't really recall vividly what that experience was like besides just driving through, going here and going there. But I was called to come to Atlanta just because of the political dynamic for African Americans in the city, the dominance that they have been able to have. I'll say that in quotes, the dominance that they have been able to have politically, the Black mayors and, the legacy behind that. I was drawn to that. I'm like, yes, this is where we can uprise and politically mobilize ourselves, because there's a commonality between ethnic groups and racial structure. But I'm also coming from a California lens where the radicalized Blacks kind of stem from the legacies of Black Panther Party. So my individual perspective of the political type of, urgency and uprising came from that kind of lens. And that can kind of be at a detriment that you are perceiving that the Black political systems will mirror cities. I think the outcomes may mirror the same, but the way that they go about liberation may look completely different just because of economics and different things like that. But nonetheless, I've been enjoying understanding the why to Black political systems in Atlanta. And I feel like Clark has done an excellent job with allowing me to navigate that experience and has pushed me beyond what I believed my limits were. as a writer, as a thinker, as a political scientist, mainly as a political scientist because my background comes from education and history. My first few years, I had I wouldn't even discredit myself and say it was basic information, but I would say the thinking again became significantly radicalized when I had to take a gap between my doctoral studies because I was primarily teaching full time in Bankhead. And that experience required so much of my intellectual energy until I came back about maybe 2 years ago. And I have been able to really understand the purpose of why my educators and my professors have pushed me, why I have had educators like Dr. Joseph Jones pushing me to become a better writer and a better thinker and a better reader and reading to comprehend the text, reading to discuss the text, reading to understand the construction of why political regimes are the way that they are. Also understanding the political theory behind it, the political sociology behind it, why man thinks how man thinks, understanding the political philosophy behind it. So I've been really intrigued now and settling into the experience here in Atlanta, through that.
Yeah. So when you say California, you're from the Bay Area?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Who is a person in history that you admire the most?
Wow. Wow. This is actually a really good question. And I'm contemplating several individuals, but I believe the person that changed my experience was Dr. Frances Cress Welsing. I read her book probably at least 5 to 6 times now. But when I first read her book, I was in complete shock of the information that she was presenting. I really enjoyed the fact that she used symbols to propose an understanding of like why symbols are constructed in a certain way. Why are things a certain color? And that kind of leans into her background in psychiatry. So it makes sense on why she was looking at it from a sort of mental or standpoint of that matter. I liked how she was talking about where the 21st century will be in terms of the deconstruction of the Black home and the way that Black men engage themselves, the way Black men engage themselves, or the way that Black women engage themselves, the way that Black children engage themselves. But also on the flip hand, her work was completely radical and some may argue anti-Semitic because of her ability to critique the structure of the United States and the way that, from a sociological standpoint, the Black family has been under that sort of regime. So her work was super impressionable to me in undergrad at Virginia State University because it was the first time that I was really reading a text that I would say went against the grain. It was totally different. It was exciting because I didn't know what the next page will lead to. I didn't know what type of research that she was going to present and how she was going to construct it. And that kind of goes to my first point and the question that you had initially, which was when you're reading something, how do you take that and then essentially operationalize it into your own better understanding? Like, how do you say that this person is really speaking truth? So it is also important for me as a reader. That's why I've read it 6 times, 5 to 6 times, because I'm like, okay, but let's see if this actually mirrors, and some of the things do, but also some of the things cannot too.
Yeah. Are you a content creator or an activist that utilizes social media?
Activist that utilizes social media.
Why do you say that?
Because I'm very intentional about what I produce. I'm not necessarily a content creator. When I think of content creating, I'm thinking phone out, talking TikToks, posting like maybe 3 times a week. You're posting on your story. You have reels. You're talking behind the reels. Not saying that I don't have the capacity to do that, but does that feel aligned to my mission and who I am? No. And quite honestly, it's a little overstimulating for me too. Like I don't know if that I want to be doing that. Like sometimes I actually want to ground myself in the experience and then reflect at a later date rather than reflecting in the moment about the experience. There are individuals that content create activism work. Kudos. Congratulations to you to be able to have the capacity. Bless you, because I personally, I'm a little bit more intentional about my creative endeavors.
Yeah. Yeah. I thought about you and it was is really interesting to hear you say overstimulate because, I thought that was just for us old folks. You know what I'm saying? It's like, what is all this going on? But it's really refreshing to hear that even younger people are like, yeah, this might be a little bit too much for me to deal with. But that means a lot when people take advantage of the tools that are out there. One of the things when I used to talk to young people and explain to them that you really have a weapon when you have that phone. We use it for our entertainment purposes, for the most part. But, when you have the capacity to reach somebody in Singapore or reach somebody in Ukraine on your phone, that's a tool that can be used to build coalitions, to learn and all that kind of stuff. And I would just encourage people to take advantage of that and look at it that way as opposed to just, something to laugh or catch the latest Netflix movie or wherever the case may be. So I kind of had a feeling that you were going to go with the activist part of the question, but I had to ask it because I don't know if anybody, even the people that do the activism and they are I don't know if they're that intentional the way that you described it. Right. So anyway, I just thought that would be an intriguing question to ask somebody that utilizes social media the way that you do.
Yes, I asked that question too.
Yeah. Audre Lorde said, when I dare to be powerful, to use my strength in the service of my vision, then it becomes less and less important whether I am afraid. When you speak up on issues, do you feel any fear or trepidation?
No, not really. Not really. I think, but I also had to work through having the fear initially. I would be lying to myself and others if I said, yeah, I was able to do it easily. So that's just not a realistic experience, especially when you live in the United States of America and you've seen people get murdered, killed, completely dismantled organizations. Like you at the end of the day, if your work is truth based or integrity driven, you're going to think about, well, if I say this may ruffle a little bit some feathers, but also at the same time, I had to realize a lot of the things that I have read or seen or watched or heard has also been watched by people that control it. So I'm quite certain that they also too have an understanding of what is actually taking place. I don't think those specific individuals are aloof to it, which is why there has been restrictions in terms of what is being said, which is even more reason why to continue to say things. Because also It's also like, but the masses aren't necessarily saying those concrete things, which kind of goes back to my first initial point to it being dismantled.
Yeah, you know, I think society, American society, doesn't understand when we try to tell them that Black people feel a dichotomy in that we grow up here in the United States, so we're socialized, from kindergarten, maybe even younger to adulthood, to be proud about being an American, right? But then we have our lived experience, whether it's in your face kind of racism or subtle stuff, how we have to process it and figure out a way to communicate the ouch, right? Because, when you get hurt, if you bump into a table or somebody hits you on a football field, you're going to say ouch in one way or the other. And we've always had to be, I don't know, creative, I guess would be the best word, to make sure that people understood that. And, one of the examples I think of, it was like there was a debate going on in the oversight committee and Jasmine Crockett was reading somebody. It was really getting into him. And a Latina woman, Ana Paula Luma or whatever her name is, from Florida, she said something like, calm down, don't get angry, just calm down, right?
Mm.
And Jasmine escalated at that point.
Mm.
So most people that are not Black looked at that and said, Jasmine's losing control. Black folks was like, how you gonna tell me to calm down? Who are you
Right.
to give me to say that? You
Right.
can act a fool all you want to, but I have to calm down. And people don't understand that. Calm down. When I used to go out and speak in public and white folks would come up to me and say that I was well spoken, right? It's like, what did you expect? You know what I'm saying? You invited me to come to speak to you. So I assumed you thought that I knew I could talk. You know what I'm saying? I could give a speech. It's just those little things like that I think puts a little trepidation, if not necessarily fear, but just a little hesitancy when we decided we want to speak out on something.
Mm-hmm.
And I not to belabor the point, because I got a couple more questions for you, but we had a debate when I was in the legislature about voter ID, and you could kind of predict who was on most issues, who was going to get up and speak, like me, for example, and who wasn't going to say anything. Now, when we get to Black Caucus meeting, everybody's got something to say. But on the floor, there was only a few of us that actually got to the well and spoke. But on this issue with voter ID, every member of the Black Caucus spoke. And it was riveting because people knew that they don't normally go up there. So when you had certain representatives, especially some of the female representatives, talking about the history of voting in Mississippi, and you had one of the chairmen who rarely speaks, on issues, what he used to when he was younger, but as he got to be an older statesman, he kind of played the game a little bit. And he hit the podium so hard that crack is still in the podium to this day. It changed the dynamic. It basically killed the bill at that particular point. Now they eventually passed it, and all that stuff years later, but that day it was over because they never saw firsthand how we rally, how we feel about certain things. They never really got a sense. And it kind of puts something in the back of their mind is like, oh, it's not just Erik Fleming or such and such or so-and-so that's speaking out. All these folks feel this way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's important for us to whatever hesitancy we have, that we speak out. And so that's, when you're young, you're not supposed to have any fear. You're supposed to be bold. But I just, because you are of this generation. I wanted to explore that a little bit with you.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Yeah. What is the most pressing issue for your generation that you would like elected leaders to address?
Ooh, probably student loans. Student loans. Um, uh, yeah, that's probably the one issue, but at least for the individuals that I am friends with outside of my immediate circle, they are teachers. And the teachers that I have as friends are, especially specifically from a K through 12 level, is the issue of literacy. That is a collective issue that we are collectively having as a community of teachers, at least in my friend or associate group, is the fact that the the kids that we are teaching are not reading at the level of where they need to be. And this is not just in the city of Atlanta, but also in the city of San Francisco and the city of Oakland. Uh, so this issue it's frightening for me, to know that as an educator that when I was teaching, I had kids that were not reading on grade level in sixth grade. And at that point, I'm not going to say it's too late, but to how I would categorize it is moving a group of far below basic to a proficient in 1 year may not necessarily be achievable. However, moving a far below basic to a basic, that is achievable. But that far below basic may be 18 students, 5 may already be at basic, and 3 may be at proficient, and 1 may be at advanced. So how do you then construct your classroom when you are then supposed to meet state demands? You're still meeting state testing, multiple testing throughout the year. And the literacy focus is not only in English, but it's also in science and social study, and it's also in math. So I believe programs like, iReady and iExcel, great programs to have online, but also at the same time, kids still need to be able to put their finger on a paper and read. I feel like reading is totally different on your laptop versus you having a pen and paper and being able to annotate it, circle, feel the page, touch the paper, touch the letters versus you just clicking. I don't know how much brain usage is being used with just clicking. And I say this as a person that has designated time for kids to do iReady and iExcel and all these things. But I think there has to be an intentionality that still requires a physical presence. I say that to say that education should not be moved to just being online, which we may come to that. We may come to a thing where AI is completely prevalent and now teachers are having to teach online. I think that will totally expedite the achievement gap to a larger discussion about socioeconomics and accessibility to resources and the accessibility to Wi-Fi within the home. What if this child comes from a low income home and they ain't got no Wi-Fi? They ain't got no Wi-Fi in there. They're using the Chromebook. So then that means that schools and school districts will have to designate a Wi-Fi router to each home. That's like totally shifting the socioeconomics within education, which again, I appreciate the online platforms, but I can see how maybe within the next 3 to 5 or 10 years, education completely shifting. So yeah, the literacy is a concern. Being able to do math is a concern, basic arithmetic, without using online, like a chat GBT. Kids are already knowing how to use chat GBT. It's sad. And then like also the if you're in a public charter school institution, the way they categorize GPA and grading, the grading scale is completely skewed. And I feel in my heart of hearts that it's almost enabling. And I mean, like overall, not just from the grading scale, but just overall, I feel in my own educational experience as a millennial, it was totally different. It was totally different. And we were the first kind of generation to be introduced to the Apple laptops. Well, not even laptops, the hardback, ginormous laptops. I remember those in elementary school. And then I also remember like the technology continuously advancing. And also gets to the point where like how far will technology advance to before it just blows up or just totally just shuts off because we have overused it. And then it's like we're using so much water to then use ChatGPT. We're draining the world. You know, how are we sucking up all the natural resources to like have some electric gravity field water driven by electricity now? So it's a twofold situation. A lot of different variables and things that I have been in discussion with my peers. But those are some of the main talking points that we usually talk about. And student loans. Keep going. I want to keep throwing in student loans because yes.
Yeah, well, excuse me, it doesn't surprise me about either one of those coming from your background, because you touch on financial stability and then you're talking about basic human stability when you're talking about education. You know, it's just fascinating to me that all these intellectual people, you know, can figure out, okay, well, these computers have to network with each other, right? That was the basic concept of the internet, that be able to get all these computers to communicate. But you forget the fact that you got that model from human beings. Human beings have to be able to network and communicate and interact with each other in order for society to function. And I just think, you know, I think back to when the Roman Catholic Church was the political power in the world. And there was this era they call scholasticism prior to the Renaissance, right? Where only the monks and the priests were educated, right? And only they could write the scriptures, you know, rewrite the scriptures, or only they could write theology and all that. And when Martin Luther said, yeah, some of us folks that speak German, we'd like to be able to do that too. You know, that was radical because they wanted to contain information. I look at all these people now in technology. I mean, Elon Musk just became the first trillionaire over the week. But it's like all of these people in technology are just, you know, narrowing. The group is small. You know what I'm saying? You've got those folks at Apple, those folks at Google and all that, but it's not everybody in America even has broadband, let alone knows how to code, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it just seems like it's that same era again where only a small group of people have the knowledge to advance technology and not everybody else has access to it. And when you have children that can't read at a level and, you know, you have people that are struggling to pay for their education, you're going to keep that gap narrow. So it just, you know, there's nothing new under the sun. It might be a different avenue of how that behavior is exposed, but it's just the same to me. So I'm glad that you talked in depth about the importance of literacy and all that. All right. So go ahead. You want to say something?
Oh no, I was just agreeing that it is very important.
Yeah. All right, so I'm going to shift it to a different direction.
Okay.
In March 1968, a FBI COINTELPRO memo stated that the program's goal was to prevent the coalition of militant black nationalist groups, to prevent the rise of a messiah who could unify the militant black nationalist movement, to pinpoint potential troublemakers and neutralize them before they exercise their potential for violence against authorities, to prevent militant black nationalist groups and leaders from gaining respectability by discrediting them to both the responsible community and to liberals who have vestiges of sympathy, and to prevent the long-range growth of militant black organizations, especially among youth. So my question out of all that is, do you think that black people need a messiah, especially in these political turbulent times?
No. My immediate answer was no, so I'm gonna say no. I honestly cringe also at the idea of there being, I guess, like, okay, so there's the Black Panther Party. So now currently someone then doing the Black Panther Party again with like afros and wearing the panther and marching and stuff, like, that makes me cringe. Honestly, it makes me cringe because I still feel like there's a level of privilege that we currently have as African Americans that our predecessors did not have. And people were literally willing to sacrifice their life. I don't know if people are necessarily willing to die for it. And I only say that because I'm not necessarily willing to die for it. I am willing to put out things, literature, and means to people that ignites and invigorates people to think differently. But I'm not necessarily willing to go in front and die. I'm not. And me as an activist, I have to be cognizant of that. But I do know the repercussions of me spreading knowledge. But I wouldn't go out with the intent of knowing that my radicalized mind means that I'm going to just die for it. No, that sort of perspective has already been within my lineage. So I still, of course, have a piece of that fire within me, but I'm catalyzing it completely different because of what I have seen, because of what I have felt, because what I have known that my lineage, what they have sacrificed, and knowing that sacrifice from my lineage looks different. It looks like my mother working 3 jobs throughout my childhood to be able to provide for me. That's a Black messiah. She sacrificed for me as her only child to be able to put me through school, to be able for me to have all the fruits and vegetables that I desire, every type of orange, every type of peach, anything that I want. Sacrifice. Her pushing me to get my education because she has her education. Because her parents didn't necessarily have the education that she had because they didn't go to college. And then my lineage before that, they didn't go to college. And then my lineage before that didn't even graduate from high school. My lineage before that were sharecroppers. My lineage before that was enslaved. So sacrifice runs through my veins. It runs through my blood. This is what I do. This is what I am as a Black woman, as a Black person. We sacrifice on a day-to-day basis. So with knowing that, I carry the energy of being my own Black messiah because of me knowing where I have came from. So it's super important that we understand the messiah within us. And we understand the interconnectedness and the power that we have bestowed within us, just with our faith and our spiritual connection. And I would also say that the shackles of bondage may not be for the masses as physically enchained, but it is a mental bondage. Just like Carter G. Woodson said, if you control a man's actions, you can control a man's thoughts. Now we have these devices where we are addicted to, and I'm not going to lie. I spent quite some time scrolling. Hey, I'm enslaved now. I've spent about 8 hours just scrolling through all the reels, having a good time. I am now mentally enslaved to my phone. Your phone is a portal to a whole nother realm of life that does not necessarily exist. Because if you put the phone down, the reality that exists in the phone does not exist. It only becomes in existence when you yourself open it up. So I would say, especially like I would also say in 2021, well, in 2020 and 2021, if you were a Black person and you had your phone, you were seeing trauma porn, as I would like to call it. Just trauma, just people dying on your phone. Now I'm being radicalized from a whole nother point because it was COVID. Now I'm just on my phone idly and I'm just seeing Black bodies on my phone. Now I have to relive the trauma of sacrifice of what my lineage has already been through, which I've already been told this. This is also the historical narrative of what I am being told about myself, because in history classes, they usually start with slavery and they end with the civil rights. Well, okay, well, thanks for letting us know that, we were able to uprise, but where is the upliftment? The upliftment cannot just be in forms of resistance. Like I think that narrative is that's so bad. That is so bad and limiting. Like I feel chills in my body to know that that is the way that people literally think that, well, y'all created your own to resist. And that's the happy moment that we're talking about. Our stories are far more greater than a 20 span of history, or even a 400 span of history. So I totally forgot the question at this point, but I hope that answers your question.
Well, no, you answered it. And so the cool thing about that whole Black Messiah thing, there was a theologian who wrote a book called The Black Messiah. And it was in response to, even though COINTELPRO was still a secret, as far as in the general public, the actual documents and all that, people that were in tune knew what was happening, right? And knew and, lived and was, this guy wrote this book 2 years after Dr. King died, and literally 2 years after this report was put out. But he was a theologian, and his argument was, we already had a Black Messiah, those of us who are Christian, and that was Jesus. And so we need to get y'all in the mindset to understand that Jesus was Black. So we didn't need a Martin Luther King. We didn't need a Malcolm X to be elevated because we already had a Messiah. But it brought up a lot of discussion about how we push people out, how we feel that we need to have this one voice. And one of the cool things about the Black Lives Movement was that when reporters would come up to ask them, well, who's the spokesperson for the group? Who's the leader and all that? Because reporters will check out who's giving the speeches and then they'll say, okay, well, that's got to be the person. And they will all collectively say, well, we don't have a spokesperson. We don't have a leader. And their argument was, you're not going to single one of us out to take one of us out, right? And so it just seemed like your generation and I guess Gen Z mindset is that we don't want you to single out anybody. We want you to deal with us as a collective. We want you to deal with Black people, African American people, not just one person that's going to speak for all of us. Because there's really not that magical person. Dr. King took advantage of the platform he had. Malcolm took advantage of the platform he had. Rosa Parks took advantage of the platform she had, right? Dorothy Height. So, I mean, everybody played a part, but, the media created the Messianic complex, not necessarily the community. And I was glad you mentioned your mom because, none of us seek to be martyrs, right? We go out and we say what we need to say. We fight for what we believe in. And the unfortunate tragedy might be that some of us might die for what we believe in, right? But, a mom, when she's having a child, is not thinking about dying. She's thinking about this new life that she's creating, right? But a woman is more vulnerable at any other point in her life when she is in gestation, when she's giving birth. That's the weakest a woman is ever in life. That's that moment. So I just look at it the same way. It's like when we put ourselves out there, when we become vulnerable, we're out there. And we're not necessarily trying to be messiahs or martyrs, but we have to put ourselves out there. So I appreciate that. I figured you'd give me a good response on that one. What is your vision of reparations for Black people?
Ooh, great question. Yes. Oh, I actually had a discussion about this. It's quite annoyed at the response. But nonetheless, I feel like reparations should be afforded to those individuals that were a part of chattel slavery, or better yet, were former sharecroppers and their lineage from the individuals that were sharecroppers. I feel like it's important to start there. And I feel like it should be individuals that were in the United States of America. As much as I understand the aspect of focusing on our brothers and sisters across the diaspora, I feel like it's definitely important to afford the lineage that were the literal byproducts of chattel slavery and their economic residuals, because they were never afforded to them to begin with. And there has been various of groups that have received reparations outside of African American descendants that have received reparations and have not been individuals of the country. They may have fled to the country and still were able to receive reparations. So I definitely will place everything on African Americans receiving reparations. They are doing a reparation project. I know of in San Francisco, they're doing one, and it's based upon if you lived in San Francisco, I believe, like, I can't remember if it was the 1960s or 1964, but you had to have lived and been a resident for X amount of years and things like that, which is, I appreciate the gesture, but also at the same time, it's probably not going far back enough. Rather, it's stopping at a midpoint of, again, the civil rights era, when they're byproducts of enslavement, but not necessarily to the far back point of sharecropping. But also at the same time, I think even, I guess, making the reparation, sorry, that noise was a lot. Making the reparations state-based, I don't feel like we've talked about that enough in terms of making reparations state-based. Because people migrate. Like, what if I moved from San Francisco in 1961, but my lineage is from there? Because there was a thing called the Great Migration and the Second Great Migration. So people were not staying in their designated areas. So how do you even designate a specific year if people were fleeing? So that is just like various questions, but I think the consensus should definitely be African Americans focused.
Yeah, that's interesting. I follow on Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it, there's a lot of debate about who should get reparations and all that. And then somebody did a study and just said basically 9 out of every 10 African Americans would qualify for reparations. So my argument is, why are we upset about 10%? Why would we even care? You know what I'm saying? If it's that many people that qualify, then let's get off of that issue. Let's focus in on what it should be. And in California, I remember when they first started talking about it in San Francisco, the NAACP president, because they talked about giving a check, I think for like $5 million or something like that. And the president of NAACP said, I don't want a check. I want better education. I want better housing opportunities. I want this. He went through a whole litany of things. And so that's why I ask people when we get into discussion, what is your vision of reparations, right? Anytime I get into discussion, I always think about the Dave Chappelle skit, right? And I just, I laugh and chuckle because we all know that's the extreme. That's not going to happen. But it just, I really like figuring out how I have an idea of what I think reparations should look like. But I always want to reach out to other people when we get into the discussion, how they envision reparations and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Sorry, I definitely think it should be economic based. And whatever somebody wants to do with their money, they can go do with their money. But I feel like it's going to prolong the process saying, we need it for this, we need it for that. I don't think everybody else did that for their reparations. They just took their reparations, and why do we have to specify what we're going to do with our money? Like, that's funny. That's kind of funny. That's hilarious. I'm sorry, but that's funny. That's like an oversteer. Like, hey, I'm going to use 5,000 of it like, for this.
I feel you. All right, let's close this out. Let's talk about your podcast, Inner Sense, and any other projects you got going on.
Yes. So I have not done any podcasting in quite some time. I've really been delving deep in creative directing and creating a documentary. So that's really my focus has been on. I had the opportunity of having a fellowship last year in New Orleans. So I was able to interview a lot of individuals and discuss the educational histories and legacies of New Orleans and how it has completely shifted the K through 12 system to 100% public charter school city, and how that has impacted nonprofit organizations, former teachers that were a part of New Orleans School Parish, and also Dr. Leona Tate from New Orleans as well. And then I'm also using Oakland's transition to public charter schools as a comparative analysis of both things. So that's really what I've been working on in terms of creatively. So I'm super excited to produce that. And I'm also working on some research that pertains to the Black Panther Party's mobilization on contemporary education and how their free breakfast program is comparatively similar to the National School Lunch Act that was then produced a few years after, and then also ratified in 1972. So, yeah, there's a lot of interconnectedness with my home being Oakland, but also how we are preserving educational legacies and how we are looking at it.
Okay. All right. So finish this sentence. I have hope because.
I have hope because the sun greets me every morning.
Okay. All right. Short and to the point. I got you. So if people want to reach out to you, if people want to talk with you about some things, get you to speak, whatever, how can people reach out to you?
They can reach out to me on Instagram, my personal profile, Authentically Dehjah, or on my podcast profile, In Her Sense. months.
Okay. Well, Dehjah Vaughn, I knew this was going to be a great interview.
Thank you, sir.
And so I thank you for that. I always try to get people that are smarter than me, which is not really that hard to do.
Oh, please.
But I thank you for coming on. And since you mentioned this documentary project, I have to mention the rule that now that you've been a guest, you have an open invitation to come back. So you don't even have to wait for me to reach out to you. If you want to, when the documentary is finished, for example, and you want to promote it or whatever, just reach out and we'll get you on. But
Okay.
it's been really, really cool to talk to you. And again, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you very much.
All right, guys. And we're going to catch y'all on the other side. All right. And we are back. And so I want to thank Crystal FitzSimons, Pauline Steinhorn, and Dehjah Vaughn for coming on to the podcast. I hope that you learned a lot from each one of them. With Crystal, I greatly appreciate the work that she's doing to make sure that, hunger in America is addressed. Again, we're sitting here acknowledging the fact that there is a human being on the planet that is worth $1 trillion. And yet there are people in that same country in America that are trying to figure out what they're going to eat. So I'm glad that there are people like Crystal FitzSimons out there that it's working to make sure that hunger in America is eventually eradicated. And then Paula Steinhorn, a beautiful person who wrote a beautiful book about her mom and her grandmother and how they survived the Holocaust. It is really, really a good book. It's really well written. And even though Pauline basically says she was more of an editor than a writer with this, the way that she composed it and put it together, you feel like you were there and you could feel the emotions and the pain that her mom and her grandma went through. So I encourage everybody to do that. And Dehjah Vaughn, beautiful spirit, beautiful sister that, as you could tell from the interview, very thoughtful, very creative, and down for the cause. And that is the name that I believe you will hear, not just in the Atlanta area, but nationwide down the road. She is an embodiment of Black millennials as far as how they process the history that we've been through, and as far as, the mindset of what direction this country should go, right? So I've been communicating with the sister for a number of years, and to finally get her on a podcast is really, really a treat. So I thank all three of those young ladies for coming on. I want to read something to you because it's relevant to what's been happening the last couple of weeks in the judicial system, dealing with young Black men. And it was written by this woman named Karen Fleshman. She's an attorney, and we're connected on LinkedIn. But she wrote a commentary. I haven't been able to get on the podcast yet, but we'll see how that works out. But she wrote something that caught my attention, and I wanted to share it with you all. She said, 11 years ago this month, I published White People. If you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. In response to a white man's massacre of 9 beloved community members of Mother Emanuel, a Black church in Charleston, South Carolina. It grieves me to this day that in their final moments on this earth, they welcomed him into their Bible study. I thought then that this horrific hate crime would cause white people in mosques to look ourselves in the mirror and change. I thought in particular white parents would endeavor to raise better children. 11 years later, even after the mass uprising of 2020 and anti-racism books read, here we are. Last week, a jury acquitted Rick Chow of murder in the death of Cyrus Carmack Belton. 14-year-old black boy who was running away from child's store, shot in the back over a bottle of water he did not take. Yesterday, a jury in Frisco, Texas, sentenced Carmelo Anthony, 19 years old and black, to 35 years for the death of a white teenager after a fight at a high school track meet. The prosecution struck every black juror who could have sat in judgment of him. The jury that remained needed less than 3 hours. After all the book clubs and black squares and promises, a Collin County courtroom still could not seat a single black person to weigh the life of a black child. This is what I meant when I said part of the problem. Not only the men who kill, the ordinary white people who build the rooms, fill the juries, raise the children, and call it neutral. Austin Metcalf's family lost a son, and I will not diminish their grief. But a system that can't imagine a black teenager as anything other than a threat is not justice. It is the same fear that has been killing black people for 400 plus years, wearing a robe and calling itself the law. And the only way that fear ends is if we white people recognize that it is wrong and not feel it anymore. Stop teaching our kids to feel it too. 2026 will be half over in a few days. By June 30, you can take tangible steps toward becoming less racist. Not someday, not after the next verdict that breaks your heart. Now. Again, that was Karen Fleshman who wrote that. And, you know, like I said, when I saw that and read that, I was like, perfect. That's how it's supposed to go, right? But Ms. Karen, I just want you to know that as much as I agree with what you're saying, and as much as I hope that your hope comes true, I know that it's really, really a reach, especially in the South, to develop that kind of mindset, that progressive mindset that's needed to do what needs to be done. I say that because, you know, I don't know why I even still follow this person, but, you know, he's not the only one, but it's just, you know, this mindset that tries to continue to justify the unjustifiable, that continues to defend the indefensible. And, you know, people want to say, well, there's no such thing as white privilege, but it happens each and every day. The news reports it each and every day. And whether you want to acknowledge it or not, that's based on the bubble that you live in, the ecosystem that you listen to and live in, dwell in. But that denial is not the reality that's here. And then some would even try to flip it and say, well, black people have privilege. And it's like, I don't think you understand the definition of privilege, right? So in the case, you know, where people miss out, they're like saying, well, you know, he did stab the kid, and why did he bring a knife to a track meet, and yada, yada, and this, that. And the issue is that a system allows, in this day and age, in the 21st century, allows a jury to be sat, and not one of those people are from the community where the defendant lives, right? Or is a part of, to think that it's okay to try to charge a young man with murder and not have one black person, not one, sit on the jury. And then, you know, we talked about this last week about the prosecution going for the home run on Chow in South Carolina. Well, this prosecutor did the same thing in Texas, but he made sure that he had a jury that would do what he wanted to do. And the scary thing is that if it was the other way around, it was this young man Metcalf who killed Mr. Anthony, it would still be an all-white jury, and Mr. Metcalf would have the same result as Mr. Chow. That's what black people are upset about. You know, we're not encouraging our kids to carry knives around white people. We're not encouraging our kids to get into fights. If anything, we're trying to discourage them from engaging in such a way that they could get in trouble with the law because we understand how things work, right? And it doesn't matter if the town is majority black or whatever the case may be. You don't want your children getting caught up in a situation where law enforcement is involved one way or the other, right? We don't want them being arrested, and we sure don't want them to be a victim. And that's a fight that we as black parents had to fight all the time. Doesn't matter if the parents don't like each other. Doesn't matter if the parents are in the same house or not. If you have a black child, you have that fear, right? You have that concern because you don't want anything harmful to happen to someone that you love. And as a black parent and having black parents, I understand that totally. But other folks don't get it. And I think that in order to get it, you've got to get out of this bubble. And when I'm sitting here and, I've been paying attention to a lot of historical documentaries and just watching the dynamics of the politics taking place this year, there seems to be a correlation with the South and prejudice. Now, you don't have to be a political scientist. You don't have to be a real scientist. I say real, but you know what I'm saying. Somebody that's into biology or chemistry or mathematics even, to see this pattern that has happened in the United States, where even when we were forming the country and putting together the Constitution, we were trying to appease the Southern states. That's where the 3/5 compromise comes from, because the South didn't want to pay property taxes because black folks were property, right? They didn't want to pay higher property taxes because they had all these slaves. But at the same time, they wanted to be rewarded for having this population so they could have political power. And so they came up with the idea, well, we're going to consider slaves 3/5 of human. That way, they're not treated as citizens, right? But they're human enough where the property taxes for these Southern planters, these rich plantation owners, wouldn't increase that much. And that was the buy off to get the Southern states to sign off on the Constitution, right? So ever since the beginning of this nation, we have had to capitulate to Southern white men, especially powerful Southern white men. And that led all the way through till the 1850s when it was coming to a head and all these new states were coming in. We had to create this Mason-Dixon line, right? The Missouri Compromise line. So any state north that was admitted to the union of that line was a free state, and anything south was a slave state. And of course, as we went further west, that line wasn't as straight, right? Because folks were making money and they didn't want to give up that money and that power, right? And then even after a civil war where the North, the Union beat the Confederates in the South, right? You still had a movement in the South that was powerful enough to influence political thought in the North. The Birth of the Nation movie, the United Daughters of the Confederacy putting statues everywhere and memorials for Confederates. And it's like anywhere else on the planet where there was a civil war, the losers were not memorialized. Even if it wasn't civil war, even if it was a takeover, once that dictator, once that authoritarian regime was removed, so was any symbolism of that, right? We've got people still alive when the Nazis were running Germany. And if you go to Germany now, there's no Hitler memorials or Goebbels or anybody else. There's no swastika statues in certain parts of the country because they wanted to get rid of that symbol and that vestige. They know it's a part of their history, can't erase that. There's film, there's books, everything. But as far as day-to-day life and moving forward, they went past that, but not America. Somehow we romanticized that, this Confederacy and the South will rise again. I mean, I was growing up, Dukes of Hazzard, right? The rebel flag on the car. The car was called the General Lee. It's been a part of our culture. And we've tried to embrace it. I mean, you know, college football, we talked about the most dominant conference is the SEC, the Southeastern Athletic Conference. It's all inbred in America. If you want to win a national championship, you're probably going to have to beat a team in the SEC to get there. It's looking like now in baseball, that's what's happening. Every now and then in basketball, that's what's happening. These are teams in the South, right? So when the NAACP or anybody else says these folks want all white men to be elected officials, then maybe you really should have all white men playing football. It used to be that way down there until a few of them coaches saw some of those black athletes playing against them, said we might need a few of them on the team, right? So, you know, it's just always been, I mean, you know, Hee Haw was like the most popular show, right? Grand Ole Opry, that's in the South, that's in Nashville, right? And that's all that was. Hee Haw was basically the Grand Ole Opry on national television every week. Same thing. So the South has always had this incredible romantic hold on the United States. But the dangerous part is the politics. It's one thing to embrace country music or even the blues for that matter. It's one thing to embrace barbecue and all that stuff. But it's a whole nother thing to embrace the racism, right? If there's one part of Southern culture that needs to be eradicated, needs to be ignored, it's the racism. That's got to end. This country is going to move forward. And there's a little correlation with that. It's like how many Southern, in modern times, since the Civil War, how many Southern presidents have we had, right? People say, well, you know, Virginia's in the South or whatever. In my lifetime, there's only been two, Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton. You've had Southerners run. Lindsey Graham ran for president, right? Ron DeSantis ran for president, right? George Wallace ran for president. Strom Thurmond. But none of them won. Al Gore didn't win. Now, George Bush beat him, so you had two Confederate states, you know, having candidates. And, you know, outside, well, Texas, if you count Texas, then you got Bush, the Bushes, Lyndon Johnson. So, you know, outside of Texas, you don't get that many, if any. So that's kind of a backhanded way, and especially as Democrats, right? So that's kind of a backhanded way society has said, well, it's all right for y'all to do this and to influence us on that and how you deal with black folks, all this stuff. We don't necessarily want you to be president, all right? But then you get a president like a Ronald Reagan or a president like Donald Trump that does everything they can to cater to whatever that Southern white political thought is, right? And I know that's a generalization. Living in Mississippi, living in Georgia, I know there's good white people in the South. I know that. But they tend to run as Democrats and they tend to get their brains beat out. Georgia is changing because of Atlanta, period. You know, outside of that, There's no other equivalent to Atlanta in any other southern state. The only thing that can happen is what's happening this election year, and that people are just frustrated. And, when they get tired and they just say, well, look, man, I got to vote my wallet this election. I think I read a quote from Einstein to Mr. FitzSimons, an empty stomach is not a good way to dictate politics, but that happens. And we're going to see a shift in the House and in the Senate after this midterm. But will we see change? There's a difference. You see the parties switching, and 1 minute the Democrats are in charge and the next minute the Republicans are in charge, but where's the change coming from? And that goes back to this whole concept of the South. I like sweet tea. I like fried chicken. All those are Southern tradition, right? What I don't like, the one Southern tradition that we need to stop practicing, is racism. And once we get that out of our system, once we get that drug out of our system, America will be so much better. Because when you go to places where activism and progressivism is more powerful than racism, you see productive activity. You see growth, right? That's why Atlanta is an anomaly. Charlotte, right? But people are trying to take it. They're trying to claw it back. They're trying to get us, as they say, the good old boys, and just say, that just ain't right. What ain't right is thinking that a belief system that enslaved people, that segregated people, that dehumanized people should be romanticized, glorified, and continued, right? Because, people say, well, we need to make America great again. And the Black community said, we just need to make America great. Because if you have a mindset that the only way America can be the best is that white people are in charge, that's not a winning strategy. We are losing our standing in the world because of that mindset. For those people who don't believe in the Bible and all that stuff, I get it. But those of us who do think Jesus is going to show up any minute now because all the stuff in Revelation is happening. War and pestilence and plagues and all this stuff. That's a curse. That's not a concept. That's not a culture. That's a curse. And until we break that cycle, we're never going to be what we should be. Every child in America should be valued. Everyone. No matter their economic status, no matter their ethnicity, upbringing, whatever. Because that's our future. That's our investment as human beings for the next generation to be better than what we were, right? But because we're caught up in this culture of privilege and isms, we are literally seeing back-to-back generations that are not doing better than us. They're struggling. You heard Dehjah talking about what's the most pressing issue? It's student loans, right? Then you got someone go, well, I didn't get a student loan. You didn't go to college. So why are you even in that discussion? Well, I got to pay it back. How? We've had this discussion before. If I say the debt no longer exists, then the debt no longer exists. It's not a burden on you or me. It's over with. Well, that's money that we lost. No, that's an investment. Dwight D. Eisenhower said that student loans was part of national security. That's how he created the program. You've heard me say that. That's fact. He wanted student loans for people to be in STEM because in his wartime military experience, he saw technology up close and personal. He dealt with those Germans who had built the Autobahn and were building rockets and the latest in air warfare and tank warfare. That's what we were up against. We just beat them because we mass produced what we could. We had the manpower and the willpower and the buy-in. But we weren't technologically advanced. That didn't happen until we made the investment in NASA. And John F. Kennedy said, we're going to the moon. And now Elon Musk is a trillionaire because we abdicated that to private industry. All I know is this. We got to be real about who we are. We got to look in the mirror like Ms. Fleshman did. And we've got to change our ways. We got to change our mindset. And when we do that, I promise you, when we do that, America will be amazing. It'll be beyond great. It'll be amazing. But we got to get people to buy into that. We got to get people to believe in that. We got to instill that in our children. Don't teach them fear. Teach them hope. Teach them promise. You don't have to give them participation trophies, but you do have to instill in them that there's good in the world, and we need to embrace that and not clutch to the pearls of fear and prejudice. We need to do better. So we won't have outcomes like Mother Emanuel or Tops Grocery Store, right? Or Carmela Anthony or Cyrus Carmack Belton. We don't Emmett Till, George Floyd. We don't Sandra Bland. We don't need those anymore. This election should be the foundation for us to truly move forward. There's some people that are not perfect, which is basically everybody running. People not perfect get elected. Okay. But if they buy into the vision of what America should be, we'll be on the right track. Again, Thomas Jefferson was a slaveholder, but his words are what freed them. We can do better. We have shown it. We've got a 250-year track record of how we've steadily made incremental progress. Now is the time for the next 250 years. Take it to the next level. All right. That's all I got. Thank y'all for listening. Until next time.
NBG Podcast Network.